Hi, this is Chapter 5, Adjustable and Variable Rate Mortgages. The objectives in this chapter are, first, to calculate the loan payments, loan balances, and interest charges on adjustable rate mortgages. Next, we want to be able to calculate the cost of borrowing or the lender's effective yield. So these are the same things as we did with the fixed rate mortgages in the last chapter, Chapter 4, but now we're adding in the different aspects of adjustable mortgages. Then we want to be able to calculate the APR of an ARM, and finally, understand the risks of both the lender and the borrower of the ARM. So we started talking about the risks and the sharing of risk in the fixed rate, but now we'll see this becomes much clearer by understanding the adjustable rate, or the ARM. So the first thing we might wonder is, why did ARMs ever come about to begin with? Why did we have these ARMs? Again, ARMs, adjustable rate mortgages, the A, adjustable R, rate mortgages, or ARMs. Well, they were basically the loans made at fixed rate interest caused very serious problems for lenders, because what they have to do is they end up having to pay market interest rates on their savings accounts, but then they have locked in long-term rates on their fixed rate mortgages. So they had to find a way to overcome this. The first thing we need to find out is make sure we understand how ARMs are different than the fixed rate mortgages. Okay, so ARMs are designed to adjust in one or more ways to changes in economic conditions. So basically, adjustable rates. So lenders and borrowers, therefore, share the risk of the interest rate changes, or interest rate risk. So as we discussed in Chapter 4, kind of brought out in a discussion question, how was interest rate shared in the fixed rate mortgages? And to begin with, a lot of students thought that that interest rate risk was shared with fixed rate mortgages, but hopefully by the end of this chapter you'll understand with the fixed rate mortgages, the interest rate risk wasn't shared. But the way that it is shared is through these adjustable rate mortgages. So let's consider some problems faced by the lender. Okay? And one of the best ways to do this is look at an example. So let's say we have a $60,000 mortgage made for 30 years at 10%, and all of a sudden, almost instantaneously, a higher rate of inflation drives up rates to 12%, and it stays at 12%, and then the loan is paid off in 10 years. Okay? So the first step is, let's figure out what the payment would have been at this 10% rate. Right? So it's a present value of $60,000 because we're borrowing that amount at 10%, so it's a monthly rate, so divide the 10 by 12 for the interest rate. 30 years, 360 months. I didn't put the future value in, but the future value is 0 because we're fully amortizing. And we compute the payment. We see that's $526.54. Okay. Next, since they're paying it off in 10 years, we need to find the balance in 10 years. So the balance is just the present value at the 10%, the contractual rate, of all the rest of the payments, the $526.54 payments. The rest of the payments, 240 of them. What's that present value? We see it's $54,562.51. Then we'd say, let's find the present value if we paid in 10 years at 12%. Okay, so what would have been the amount that should have been lent out if we made the same payment that we calculated? If we received the repayment of $526.54, and then we were paid off the loan with the $54,562, but if instead of the 10%, we should have received the 12%, which was the market rate. So because we're assuming that market rate changed immediately after we issued the fixed rate at 10, but immediately it changed for 12. So we should have really been getting a 12% return. So we say, what amount should we have been lending to get that 12% return? So we solve for the present value, and we see that it was $53,232.27. So there was really a loss between the $60,000 that the bank actually lent and the $53,232 $232 that they should have lent to get the 12% return, they had a $6,786 loss. Okay, so you might say the loss to the lender is the gain to the borrower, but this is only true with the losses. It doesn't work the other way around, because if, on the other hand, we don't have the losses to the borrower go to the lender as gains, because if the interest rate goes down, if the other way the interest rate went down to 8%, then the borrowers can usually refinance. So we saw that with fixed rate lending, the risk bearing is not symmetric. It's not equal. Okay, it was once it goes down below a certain point, that it becomes profitable for the borrower to just refinance, and then the lender is stuck with lending that money back out at that lower rate of return. The lender also has the problem of mismatched maturities of assets and liabilities, which is also referred to as borrowing short and lending long, this maturity gap. And this makes it a little bit clearer if we look at the example. It's on page 13 in Exhibit 1 and 2 on my next slide. So we see here on this exhibit, they say Exhibit 1 shows what the bank had thought was going to happen. So at this point in time, they've got a third of their assets in 11% mortgages with a 2 to 3 year maturity, a third in 12% mortgages at 4 to 5, and a third in 13% mortgages with a 6 to 7% maturity. So they're lending out money with an average return of 12%, and the expected maturities on average about 4.5 years. And then on the other side, they're paying out for their deposits. They've got a third in less than a year, so we have 0 years to maturity, so very current term, and that's currently at 9%. A third that's due in a year, and that's at 10%, and a third that's due in 2 years, and that's at 11%. Okay, so we see the gap between what they're lending out at 12 and what they're paying out at 10 is called the spread, and that's basically what the bank's making to cover all their costs and what they'd have as profit. But then if all of a sudden the short-term rates went up, if the short-term rates just go up and they're fixed-rate mortgages, we'll see this in Exhibit 2, the mortgage amounts don't change because they're fixed. But the short-term rates go up immediately, so they have to pay out to their in their savings account. All of a sudden it goes from 9 to 11. They have to pay that out. So everything else stays the same, except a third of their deposits are now at 11%. So that changes their deposits to 10.7. So now their spread is only 1.3. Okay, so they have much less of a spread on their assets, because it's 1 point of the total assets. That's what they could make. Instead of making 2%, they're making 1.3%. So now if they barely cover their costs and have no profit at all. And you see that the difference between the maturities, and we know that the shorter the maturity, the more volatile it is to interest rates, and you'll see that the deposit side is shorter maturity, so more volatile, and the mortgage side is a longer term maturity, so less volatile in that case. So they've got both the change here and the volatility. So this is a big problem for the banks. So just quick history. For many years, this maturity gap wasn't really a problem because rates were low and investors weren't really motivated to move their money. So rates didn't change that much and they were low. So people just left their money in the savings accounts. Then in the 70s and early 80s, when inflation was high and all of a sudden you had money markets coming out that were being run by some of the mutual fund companies and were getting 17, 18%, people didn't leave them in the savings accounts anymore. And at that point, the savings accounts were under a Regulation Q, which said that the bank could only raise their deposits, the amount that they were paying their deposits in the savings accounts, to a certain degree. So they couldn't become competitive even if they wanted to. But at that point, Congress eliminated those regulations and let the savings institutions increase the interest rates. And so now they could increase them, but they had to find a way to be able to do it because of the maturity gap was now huge. So they had to say, how can we maintain competitiveness, pay the savings accounts these rates, and still basically back them with these long-term mortgages. So this prompted the changes in the mortgages, or the ARMs. One of the first attempts at these adjustable rate mortgages were the price level adjusted mortgages, or the PLAM. This is a type of variable mortgage payment. It's not widely used anymore, but it illustrates one of the problems that had to be overcome. So I want to just use it as an illustration. We won't really dwell on it much after this, but just look at it quickly as an illustration. So the key thing here is it's based on the rate of interest consisting of the real rate and risk premiums and payments. The easiest way to understand these PLAMs, is to look at an example. So let's say $60,000 mortgage. It's at 4% for 30 years, but it's indexed to the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Okay, so the first thing for the first year, we just calculate what the payment would be if we borrowed $60,000, our present value, with an interest rate 4 divided by 12 for 360 months. It's 30 years. Future value 0. And we compute the payment, $286.45. Okay. At the end of the first year, we now have to find the balance, because what we're going to do is that balance is increase it by the CPI, by inflation. So we find the balance, but just the present value of all the rest of the, in this case, 348 payments. We find that's $58,945.61. We see that for this year, during the past year, the inflation rate was 6%. Again, that's the past year because it's a measurement in the past. But that's the way the plan was set up. So we take that balance at the end of the first year and we increase it 6%. So it goes to $62,482.34. And now we calculate what would be the payment to pay off that $62,482.34 at 4%. That doesn't change. Okay, only the balance at the end of the year increases by the inflation amount, but the 4% stays the same. And now we only have 348 months to pay it off because we've already gone through 1 year. So we see the payment now is $303.65. And we would continue to do that each year. So then the second year, we'd find the balance at the end of the second year, increase that, but whatever the inflation rate was for that past year, now calculate what would be the payment, but now we'd only have 336 months to pay it off. Okay. The next exhibit on the next page shows what this payment and loan balance would look like if inflation continued at 6% every year. Okay, and remember, our fixed rate, in effect, is 4%. Okay, so inflation is higher than the rate of the loan. So we see here when we look at this chart, what's going to happen. Because the loan's at 4%, but inflation's growing at 6%, we see that that payment is going to be increasing, okay, and increasing at an increasing rate, right? So we start at just under $300. By the time we get a month, by the time we get to 15 years, we're almost double that, a little over, actually, we are double that, a little over $600. And by the time we get to 30 years, we're up to $1,500, right? So 5 times what we started out with. Okay, so we see that that's a big problem. Although we, did say that we would like something that increases with, our income and such. This looks like it was increasing much more. The other key thing about this is the next panel B, the outstanding loan balance. We see we get a huge amount of negative amortization. Because this loan starts out at $60,000. But if we look 15 years out, it's up to almost $90,000. Okay, so the loan balance has increased almost 50% halfway through. And then we start to see that we do start to pay this off at that point. But that negative amortization makes it a risky loan. So looking at a summary of the plan, we see it has some advantages. Because it started with such a low payment, many more people could qualify. So that was helpful. And it also helped remedy the problems of the savings imbalance and interest rate effects of lenders, because we had, at least it was adjusting and changing with interest rates. However, there were more disadvantages. Negative amortization, as we pointed out in the chart before. And then that CPI may not really be a good indicator of housing indexes. Okay, so for example, right now, we see housing prices actually decreasing, and we see that inflation is increasing. So we have increasing inflation, decreasing housing prices. So oftentimes you'll see that inflation and housing prices do not move together. It may not be a good indicator of salary increases or deposit rates either. Okay? The index is also based on a previous period. Okay, so it's based on what happened last year, and now you're making an adaptation for this year. So again, history might not follow what happens in the next period. So they decided they needed to develop a new type of deposit account indexed to price levels so that loans and deposit yields would move together. So that was at that point they developed more the typical adjustable rate mortgage, which is not typically adjusted at all to CPI. So we have lenders that choose a variety of mortgages with interest rates indexed to market interest rates. Okay, so by using the market interest rate index, like Treasury rate, LIBOR, something along those lines, instead of inflation, then we're not getting with the CPI a post-inflation. We're getting a expectation of inflation, because remember, built into our yield curve, when we look at what our rate would be at a certain point in time, especially if we see like an increasing yield curve, it tells us the theory. One of the theories is anyway that gives us the expectation that investors think that inflation will be increasing. Or if we have a decreasing yield curve, and we would get the expectation built in that interest rates would go down, or flat yield curve, the expectations that they would be unchanged. So at least we'd get that expectation of future inflation by using market interest rate indexes. So let's look at a typical example of an adjusted rate mortgage. $60,000 mortgage has an initial interest rate of 10% for 30 years, and we'll say that this one's going to be adjusted at the end of each year based on some interest rate index. Okay, so how would we go about this? Okay, so first year is easy, gave us 10%, so $60,000 is our present value, what we're borrowing. Again, we put that in as negative. 360 is the end, because it's 30 years, so 360 months, 10%, so divide that by 12 for the monthly rate. Future value is 0, because this is fully amortizing, and we compute our payment. And we see it's $526.54. Okay. Now we have to find the balance at the end of year 1. Okay. And again, they're assuming here the interest rate is going to go up to 12, but first we need to find the balance at the end of year 1. So it's just the present value of all the rest of the payments at that 10% rate. Okay. So solve for that, $59,666.14. Okay. So we take that number then, and we now say that becomes the present value. Because basically what it is like starting out all over again without any refinancing charges or such. But it's like starting out, every adjustment period starts out all over again. The ending balance is like the amount you're borrowing. No closing costs or anything like that at this point, but the amount you're borrowing for one less period. Okay, and the adjustment period in this case is 1 year, so one less year. So we started with 360, so now we're down to 348. And now we just use the current rate, which they now said has gone to 12. 12 divided by 12. But the interest rate, again, it is still fully amortizing, so our future value is 0. And we compute the payment, and we see now that it's $616.97. Right, so almost $100 a month has gone up because of the interest rate change. That's a simple example of how an adjustable rate mortgage would work. Then again, at the end of the second year, find out what the balance is. What is the current rate? Use that rate, but now you'd only have 336 payments to pay it off in. So what are some observations we can make so far? Okay. Well, the use of ARMs does not completely eliminate all interest rate risk. And why do we say that? We say that because even though, for example, in the last example, we said, Well, we started at 10 and the rates changed to 12, so then we were allowed to change our mortgage to 12. But what would happen if, exaggerating, but what would happen if the day after the bank lent that money at 10%, the day after rates went right to 12? Well, granted, it will adjust a year from now, but they do have the entire year where they're locked into 10%, even though the rates are currently at 12. So they do get to adjust in a year, but there's still some risk during the year. Okay. So what does that tell us? Well, the longer the adjustment interval, the greater the interest rate risk to the lender. The shorter the adjustment rate interval, the less the interest rate risk to the lender. Okay. So if you have a adjustable rate that adjusts every month, right, very little risk to the lender, a lot more risk to the borrower. If you have an adjustable, they have adjustables that are like 5 years. So it only starts to adjust after 5 years. So the first 5 years, all the risk is still on the lender. Okay. At that point, it would start to adjust to the borrower. So we see that adjustable rate mortgages start to give some of the risk to the borrower, so take some away from the lender and give it to the borrower, but we can see we can give it in varying degrees. And one of the ways that we could, depending on how we could give that risk over, is how often do we adjust? The more often we adjust, the more risk the borrower is giving to the lender. As the lender assumes less interest rate risk, the borrower incurs more interest rate risk. Okay? And so therefore, because the borrower assumes more risk, then the initial rate on the ARM should be less than with the fixed rate. So because the borrower says, hey, if I'm taking some of this risk, then I should be able to get a lower rate. And that is what happens. Adjustable rate mortgages have a large set of characteristics. And all of these characteristics, so far we've only talked about how often they adjust, but many of these characteristics are how we can share the risk. So let's look at some of them. Okay, the initial rate. Okay, so what's the initial rate we use? Is it, first of all, going to be lower than the fixed rate? And is it going to be based off the Treasury, LIBOR? It's going to be based off 6-month Treasury, 3-month Treasury. Okay, so what's the initial rate? Then so what's the initial rate? Then what index are we going to use? 6-month Treasury, 3-month Treasury, 5-year Treasury, some weighted average, some national average, the LIBOR, which is the London International Bank rates. So we could use a variety of these different market-based interest rates. The shorter the term, okay, so 6-month versus a 5-year Treasury index, the shorter the index, and the shorter the maturity of the index, the more volatile the interest rates, the more often they change, so the more risk that goes to the borrower and gets taken away from the lender. The adjustment interval, just talked about that a lot. The shorter the adjustment interval, the more often it adjusts, the more risk there is to the borrower, the less to the lender. And the margin, okay, the margin is when after the lender picks an index, they'll always put some amount above the index. So they might say 3-year Treasury plus 2. Now the margin would be the 2. So that spread is going to be a factor. The higher that spread, the more risk that the borrower is taking. Continuing with the characteristics, just this definition, the composite is the index plus the margin, so a combination of those two. Then there's limitations, or often referred to as caps. And this is the maximum amount, and there can be maximums between each interval and the maximum over the life. So a common is a yearly adjustable, and a common range is something like 2.25. And basically a 2.5 says it can go up 2% a year, but 5% maximum for life. Or often another common one is a 1.5. So the most it can go up is 1% a year, but over the life it can never go up over 5%. So say you're starting today at 7% for an adjustable. Well, the most it could go up after 1 year is to 8. Then the next year, even if rates were up at 15 next year, the most go up is 1. And the next year, the most it go up is 9, and so forth. And over the life of the loan, if you started at 7, it could never go higher than 12. Okay, so those would be the limitations. And most ARMs do have those, but not all. So you should understand those. Negative amortization. So if there is a cap, okay, so if I said, for example, with the 7%, next year the most you go up was 8, but if the current market rates were 12, the question is, does it allow negative amortization? Because if it allows negative amortization, granted, your payment will be based off an 8% rate, but the extra amount you're not paying would be added onto your loan balance, or you're going to have negative amortization. So that becomes very important, and it really takes away a lot of the protection of the caps if you have negative amortization. Then there's floors, the maximum reduction. Oftentimes loans might have a maximum reduction, so it can only go down. So if your rates are falling, so if we're at 7 now and next year they're at 5, you might say, well, it can't just fall 2%, it only can fall 1%. And a few other characteristics that these are really some quick overview that could be, we saw similar characteristics with the fixed rate. It could be possibly assumable, again, very rare, can have points or not. Again, as we looked at in the newspaper, we can almost always find any type of mortgage with and without points. And it probably will have prepayment privileges, but may have prepayment penalties too. So you need to check those out. So let's look at an example. We include some of these different factors. So before we had a $60,000 30-year loan at 10% that was adjusted annually, but we didn't have any caps. So let's look at that. So now it's adjusted annually, an index of the 1-year treasuries, plus 2, so that's the margin, with a 2.5 rate cap. So go up most 2% a year. Remember, if the rates only go up 1%, it will only go up 1%, but the most can go up is 2% a year, and over the life of the loan, the most it can go up is 5%. Has a 2% floor, so it can never drop more than 2, and it has a negative amortization is allowed. So even though the rate may only go up 2%, if the market rates go up higher than that, you'll be charged that amount, and it will be put onto the balance of the loan. And in this case, it is not assumable. So that would have been typical standards that are set into a mortgage. Want to just quickly look at some of the problems that these ARMs are faced, the lenders and borrowers are faced with these. The borrowers, they're complicated to understand. More and more people are growing up with these, so they're not becoming quite as complicated, but still they are more complicated than just say, you're going to pay this payment for 30 years. Also, they're priced below the fixed initially, but there's an uncertain future, so we don't really know where they could go, so it could increase your payment. As far as the lenders, what are the problems? Well, they're difficult to price because they're not really sure where interest rates are going also, how much of the risk is really going to be shared. If they're improperly priced, you may earn an inadequate yield, and then they'd have a difficulty paying off their depositors or their savers in the market rates. And because some of the interest rate risk is onto the borrower, there's a higher rate of default. Okay, so when you're now giving one of your risks onto the borrower, so now the borrower has more risk, okay, because their payments could go up, and or they could have negative amortization, so their loan balance could go up depending on the terms of the loan. So because of that, the borrower has higher risk overall, and so therefore higher default risk, and thereby that reduces some of the benefit. Okay, so that's kind of a quick review of the considerations. All right, the fixed rate, it's over the life of the loan, one fixed rate. But we have an unanticipated inflation. We don't know really where inflation is going to go, so we're trying to be able to take that into consideration. We're uncertain about all the risk premiums. with a fixed rate. Will people prepay or not? So on one hand, if the rates go up, the fixed rate, you're stuck because you have locked in a low rate. On the other hand, you don't get to keep the high rate. So you have uncertain expectations about your prepayment, uncertain expectations about your interest rate change, and you've got this maturity gap to deal with. So these are all the considerations that lenders are taking into account when they're deciding, should we offer adjustables, and when we do, what are the terms, what's the interest rate, and what are the terms. So let's focus on some specific examples that will illustrate and focus on the rate risk and default risk of adjustable rate mortgages. For this, we're going to look at Exhibit 5.4 in your books, and I've written them down here. And this exhibit takes a little bit of studying, but I kind of put some notes on the side here. The key thing is, let's look at panel A. It's saying on the bottom there across the x-axis, it says the interest rate risk to the lender. And then up vertically, it says the interest rate risk premium. So saying, as we increase the risk to the lender, what happens to the premium? Okay, how much are we going to charge for that? So we'd see that the more interest rate that's assumed by the lender, the higher the risk premium. Okay, and that's maxed out with the fixed rate, because at the fixed rate mortgage, this would be point B on panel A there. That's where the lender is taking all the interest rate risk. So they're going to charge the highest risk premium. And you'll see down, as we move down with different types of adjustable rate arms, we'd see we move down, we're giving less, the lender's taking less and less and giving more and more to the borrower. So as the lender takes less interest rate risk, they can reduce the interest rate premium and therefore lower that initial rate. On the other hand, if we look over on panel B, remember we recall that as though the interest rate risk to the lender goes down, so if the interest rate risk to the lender is going down, that means the interest rate risk to the borrower is going up. So as the interest rate risk to the lender goes down, the default risk goes up. Okay, so you're giving now more interest rate risk to the borrower, so therefore there's more default rate risk to the lender. There's more chance, since that the borrower is saying, okay, I'm going to let my payments possibly go up, I might possibly let my loan balance go up, there's more possibility that they'll default. Okay. Panel C combines these two. You'll see that for the adjustable rate, as you look to the far left there, where you have the least interest rate risk to the lender, at that point you'll have the most default rate risk. Okay, and you'll see as then that increases, the interest rate risk goes up and the default rate risk goes down, so you'll get a total risk with a little bit of a less slope, a declining slope. So it's increasing, but an increasing slope, but a declining rate. And panel D is just to show you that this holds true, but basically you might have one borrower who's riskier than the other. And so we just see that the parallel line goes up. So if you'd have borrower 2 versus borrower 1, and borrower 1 is riskier, we just charge a higher premium, but it moves up to, in a parallel line. And same with the fixed rate. Okay. So what we can start thinking about is mortgage lending viewed as risk pricing. Okay, so how do we price risk? So we can look at it and say, well, we can change all the things. We can change the initial rate. We can change the index. What do we base it off? 1-year treasuries, 5-year treasuries. How often do we adjust? Monthly, semi-annually, annually, every 5 years? Do we put any caps on? Do we have annual negative amortization? All of these tools allocate risk. Okay, and we can assume that ARMs are not made unless the expected benefits to the lenders from shifting some of that interest rate risk to the borrower exceeds the expected losses that they would be assuming from default risk. looking at the yield relationships and interest rate risk, we'll see, again, the initial rate on the adjustable rate should be lower than the fixed rate, and the expected yield on an ARM would be lower than the expected yield on a fixed rate, because again, we have the borrower or the lender would be saying, well, I'm taking less risk, so I can assume I'm going to get a less of a return. Adjustable rates that are tied to shorter term indexes are generally riskier, more volatile, interest rates change more often, than those tied to long-term indexes. And ARMs with shorter adjustment periods are riskier to the borrowers than those with longer adjustments. And the use of caps lowers the interest rate risk to the borrower, and therefore the lender should get a higher return. This is as long as there is no negative amortization. If there's no negative amortization, this is not hold true as much, and we'll see a demonstration of that. If negative amortization is allowed, then the caps do not materially reduce interest rate risk because the foregone interest is really just deferred. It becomes part of the loan balance. So next we're going to look at Exhibit 5.5, and we're going to see three different adjustable rate mortgages and a fixed mortgage. And then we're going to look at the differences between these to try to understand which one has the most risk and which one has the least risk. So the question here is, first of all, I'm asking is, why are the initial rates different? Okay, and well, let's get to the next slide and see if we can figure out how. Okay, looking at Exhibit 5.5, we see, again, 3 adjustables and a fixed rate. The first thing you'll notice that the initial rates on the adjustables, ARM 1 at 8%, ARM 2 9%, ARM 3 11%, and then the fixed rate at 14%. Okay, so we have an increasing initial rates. The loan maturities are the same. Okay, a fixed rate obviously doesn't adjust for line C there, but the adjustable, the time period, the period adjustment is 1 year for all of the other 3, so those are all equal. The margin above the index, those are all 2%, so that's equal. The adjusting, the maturity of the index is 1 year, and the adjustment interval is 1 year. Okay, so for all the adjustables so far, and the points are all 2. Okay, so 30 years for all the adjustable. The index is 1 year of maturities, 2% margin above the index. Everything adjusts in 1 year, and there's 2 points on all of them. So up to that point, the adjustables are all equal, except that they have different initial interest rates. So we'd say, well, why? Okay, and that comes in these next 3 lines. In ARM 1, there are no payment caps, no interest rate caps, and they allow negative amortization. It's not really an issue because there are no caps. So there's no caps, that we don't need negative amortization. It's like not applicable. Okay, so at this point, all the interest rate risk within 1 year. Okay, now so not completely, not all interest rate risk, because the bank's still holding the risk that goes on within the year, because this adjusts during that year. But within that, after that year, everything else is, besides that, all the other interest rate risk is passed on to the borrower. In ARM 2, there's a payment cap of 7.5%. With the payment cap, what it says is after you figure out what your first payment is, that payment can only increase 7.5%. Okay? But the interest rate, there is no cap on. So although the payment can only go up so much, the interest rate can go up to wherever the market rates go, and there's negative amortization allowed. So yes, your payments are limited, but you're not really buffered much as a borrower by that, because you're still getting all the interest rate effects. It's just getting added to your loan balance. Okay, so a little bit more buffer than the ARM 1, because your payments are being maintained only at a small growth rate, but everything else is being passed on after 1 year. And then ARM 2, we'd say, well, there's no payment cap, but there's an interest rate cap, and there's a lifetime cap that can never go over 5%, And there is no negative amortization with the lifetime cap saying, no, that's as high as it can ever go. And there's no negative amortization. So therefore, yes, you can pass them on every year, up to 2% a year, up to 5% max. So some interest rate risk is being passed on to the borrower, but not all of it. And then with the fixed rate, obviously none of that is passed on. So we see, as I wrote very up on the top there, the lender has the least interest rate risk, the borrower the most. In ARM 1, the lender has the most interest rate risk and the lender the least in the fixed rate. Now let's quickly look at an example of all of these, because you'll need to be able to understand these for your spreadsheet project. So we're going to look at Exhibit 5.6. It's on the next slide. You can also look at it in your book. This takes the case of ARM 1, okay, where in this case, $60,000 loan, we're going to start an initial rate at 8%, 30-year mortgage, 1-year adjustable, and they're going to give you what the index is. So they're telling you what the index is. 10, 13, 15, and 10. Okay, so at the end of year 1, it goes to 10 plus the margin of 2. And then we compute the payments, assuming these forward rates, and we assume that there is no caps. So if we look at this chart here, we'd say, well, okay, well, first what we do is we figure out when we borrow $60,000, 360 months at 8%, 8 divided by 12, future value 0, we come up with the payment, $440,426. Now we use that to find the balance at the end of the year. Okay, $59,499. So that now becomes our present value, the new basically amount you need to borrow, and the new rate becomes your index of 10 plus the margin of 2, so that new rate is 12. Okay, divide that by 12, but now you only have 348 months left. You calculate your payment, you say it's $614.25. Okay, use that number, say, well, now I have used the $614.25 with 336 payments left at the 12% to find your present value, or your balance at the end of year 2, $59,255. That now becomes the present value, and you look and you see your index was 13 plus 2 is 15. It's going to jump 3%. There's no caps. Just going to go to whatever the index plus the margin is. Use 15%, and now you've only paid off 2 years, so you have 336 payments with 15%, and you calculate a payment of $752.27. Okay, so play with your calculator, make sure you can duplicate some of those. But you'll see the payment goes up the first year, 39%, next year, 22%. And finally, when the rates start going down, you'll see between year 4 and 5, the payment actually goes down 27%. Okay, so this is where, beyond the 1 year aspect, because there is 1 year between them, but the most interest rate risk is passed on to the borrower at this point, where some years the payment's going up 39%, and then 22%, and then 12%. Okay, so if you add these all up, it's 75% in 3 years. Then all of a sudden it makes 27% drop. Okay, so a lot of change. Okay, so now we're looking at example 2, where we have payment caps and negative amortization. Okay, so here we know for one reason there's more risk to the lender because the initial rate is higher. Okay, but we know part of this is that because the loan balance is going to be increasing. Okay. Now this one tends to be one that gives the students a little bit of hard time because you've got to keep figuring out basically kind of 2 payments. What's the capped payment, but what would be the amount you'd be paying if this wasn't capped, so you could figure out how much the loan keeps increasing. Okay, this chart is the negative amortization, 7.5% payment. This chart can be a little bit confusing, mainly because it doesn't go through month by month. It does it by a whole year. So I've made some marks on here to kind of show you where some of these calculations came from, and then hopefully from that you could figure it out. But when you do it on a spreadsheet, you would just be doing every month. So we start out with the $60,000 balance at the beginning of year one. We know that. And we started out with an 8% rate. No, 9% for ARM 2. So we put in, and I wrote that up at the very top margin of this page, the present value is 60,000 for 360 months, 9 divided by 12, the future value is 0, and you compute the payment. And you came up with the $482.77. So that's where they came up with that first payment. So it's under the uncapped payment, it's the very first payment. And we would then use that and come up with, then down below, we'd say, well, how much of that was interest and how much is amortization? So if we took just 9% divided by 12 of the 60,000, we'd say 450 of it was interest. So the remaining 3227 was the amortization. Okay. Now, what they're doing in the next column, in column 8, is figuring out, well, what's using that monthly, that very first month amortization to figure out what the annual amortization is. So they could just do it on a yearly chart rather than month by month. Again, you could, on your spreadsheet, you'll just be doing month. And we'll look at some of those. But, so how do you get that? Well, I wrote that below columns 6, 7 there. The present value is 0. Your payment is the $32.77. During that first year, it's 9%, so 9% divided by 12, 9 divided by 12 is your interest, and it's for 12 months, so N is 12, and you compute the future value. And you see that becomes, in this case, $409.87. Okay. The next year, it's actually a negative amount, okay, because we find out that the interest is $595.90, but the capped payment, okay, if you look in column 4, you take the $582.77 and you increase it by 7.5%, it can only go to $518.98. But your interest payment due that second year is $595.90, excuse me. So therefore, you have negative amortization. So the $595.90 minus the $518 is $76.92, which is a negative amount. Okay, so you use the same formula as I put down below. Present value 0. In this case, the payment, instead of being $32.77, it's $76.92. The interest rate's now 12 divided by 12. N is still 12, and you compute the future value. And because it's negative 76, you'll get a negative 975.54. Okay. And then each year, so the first year we had the 60,000, then we subtracted the 409.87 to get a new balance of 59,590. But the next year we take that 59,590, $59,590, we increase it by the $975 of negative amortization. So the balance at the beginning of the third year goes up to $60,566. Okay. So you can continue that process where you're calculating the uncapped balance. So off the balance with the current rate, what would be your payment? But then on the other hand, you have to say, what are the people actually paying? Which means you just keep increasing your capped payment, only 7.5%. Now, if you hit the situation where your capped payment goes higher than the uncapped payment, then you would switch back to the uncapped payment because you wouldn't be paying more than your capped amount. The capped amount's the most it can go up. But if the interest rates were going down, okay, then you could go less than your capped payment. If there were, again, if there wasn't negative amortization. So if you started out right away from the beginning with interest rates going down, then your payment wouldn't increase. Okay. And this is kind of just a continuation of, or a summation continuation of the ARM 2 here, where it shows you the payments. It shows you how the loan balances increase. So the payments just go up 7.5%, but you see the loan balance is going up. And it maxes at about 6.1% increase, but so total though about 11%, and then it starts going down. The third example The ARM 3 is where we have interest rate caps and no negative amortization. This is a very common type of ARM. So no negative amortization. If rates go up over the cap, lenders will lose the interest rate over the capped rates. So in this case, more risk to the lenders. So there's an initial rate of 11%. So we first cap 1, 8%, cap 2 at 9%, and this goes up to 11. But it's still below the fixed rate, which is at 14. So looking at this summary data for this one, we start at the 11%, borrowing the $60,000, 360 months, we calculate a payment of $571.39. Gives us an ending balance of $59,730. We go back and we say, okay, what is the margin plus the index? And it's 12%, okay, which is only 1% higher than the capped rate, so that's okay because we can go up as much as 2%. And so now we use the 12% with the $59,730, but now it's only for 348 months, and we calculate at 12% what that payment would be, and it's $616.63. So for a 7.4% increase. Calculate the ending balance, $59,485. We look back at the margin, and we see now the margin plus the index is up to 15%. But we won't go up to 15. We'll only go to 14 because we are capped at only 2% a year. Okay, so it goes up to 14%. Now, use the 14% with the ending balance of $59,485 for 336 months, and you get a payment of $708.37, which is a 14.9% increase. So it's increasing, almost 15%, but it didn't increase as much as it would have because of the cap. Okay, we go over to the next margin, and we see that it's up to 17%. Okay, but we can't go up to 17% because we can only go up 2% a year. Okay, so it goes up to 16. We recalculate and get the payment. The next year we look, and now the margin, index plus the margin has gone down to 12. And so since there was no floor of the amount, it can only drop a certain amount a year as a floor, we can go right back to 12. Okay. If that capped rate, say the next rate had been 19, okay, remember the life can only go up to 5. So we would have maxed out at 16. So if in year 5 instead of 12 it said 19 or even 18, it wouldn't have mattered. We couldn't go, or even 17 again. We couldn't have gone again because the most we could go was the beginning 11 plus 5, which is 16, which is where they were at already. So that was the most it could have gone to begin with. Okay. So for any of these, how would we compute the IRR? Well, we'll just look at, you can look at Exhibit 510 and 511, but you would take whatever, they use the example for ARM 1, and at closing cost of $1,200, they take that out. That would be your cash flow at time 0. Then they calculated the payment for the first 12 months. You put that in as cash flow time 1. That would be a frequency of 12 months. So F1 would be 12. Use what you calculated for the second year for the payment, $614.30, 12 months, and so forth, until the assumption here is that you're going to sell at the end of the 5th year. So during that 5th year, you have $617.60 payments for 11 months, but that final payment on the 60th month is the $617.60 plus the ending balance, which is $58,639. So that becomes what your cash flow 6, and that only happens once. It's the 60th payment, because you'll see there's 12, 12, 12, and 11, so you've got 59 payments have gone through, so it's the 60th payment. You're making the principal payment plus your regular mortgage payment. Calculate that rate, gives you the monthly rate, multiply times 12, and you get the IRR of 12.98. Now this just summarizes, again, the risk to the lender with the total risk, saying the interest rate premium, and the total risk adding the default premium. But now it's just saying, plotting our examples, being at the far left, the ARM 1, which had the least rate interest rate risk to the borrower, the most to the lender. We see that at the far left end with the total risk premium. And then that risk premium goes up a little as the risk to the lender increases, but not proportionally as much because the default risk is not quite as high. Again, with ARM 3, the risk to the lender goes up, so the total risk premium goes up, but again, not proportionally as much because the default risk goes down. And then finally, you get to the fixed rate mortgage. And the last type I want to talk about quickly is the shared appreciation mortgage, or the SAM. And this is very not used often, and we'll talk about why, but it's designed to deal with this problem of the uncertainty of inflation. So here, the lender agrees to receive some agreed upon appreciation of the value of the home that's used as collateral. The easiest way to do this is to look at an example. So we'll look at an example. We've got a SAM, 9%, 30 years, and the lender agrees to receive half of the appreciation, but they don't share in the depreciation, okay, as far as that goes for tax purposes and so on, due in 10 years, either through an appraisal at that point or if it's sold at any point earlier than that. So if it's sold after 5 years, they get half of the appreciation at that point of whatever they sold it at. But again, they don't share in the depreciation. So if the house went down in value, they wouldn't share in it. So first we compute the payment, borrowing $60,000 for 360 months at 9%, and we get a payment of $482.77. Okay. Then they assume a 6% inflation, so that's what they're assuming. The house grows at inflation. We purchased house was purchased at $90,000, so they say we increase that at 6%, and that would be to the 10th power. So it's 90 times 0.06 to the 10th. I couldn't find the subscript in PowerPoint there. And that goes out to the value of the property at the end of the 10th year would be $161,176. So the appreciation is $161,176 minus the $90,000 you originally bought it for. So it's gone up in value $71,176. Okay. Now half of that's going to go to the bank. Okay, so half of that's $35,588. So at the end of the mortgage, that 10th payment, you have to find out the balance at the end first. Okay, so you calculate that. You find it's $53,657. And then to calculate the IRR, they don't include any points or closing costs. So the cash flow times 0 is just the $60,000 that you borrowed. Then you make your payment, the $482.77 for 119 payments. On the 120th payment, you'd have to make the $482.77 plus pay off the balance of the loan, $53,557 plus 50% of the appreciation, $35,588. Okay, so that gives you a cash flow. The second cash flow 2, $89,727.77. That just happened once. You get the IRR for the month, multiply it times 12, and you see it comes out 12.17. Okay. Now this would probably be, your decision might be do this or a $60,000 fixed rate for 12% for 30 years. Okay, so you might decide, I'll go with this, and if my property doesn't appreciate as much, if it only appreciated instead of at 6% at 3%, well, you could crank that out and find out what your return did, but obviously it would be less than 12. And if your property appreciated more, you'd be paying them more than 12%, but you'd also be getting a greater return because your property would have gone up more in value. So it's based more on the inflation rate for your home, not general inflation. So although we're making an assumption here of saying inflation, it would actually be the value of the home. So it would actually be on the inflation rate of your home. The SAM isn't used much. Why not? Mainly because lenders don't want to wait the 10 years. Okay, because most of their payment, then a huge chunk of it is coming at the end of the period. Now, many lenders at this point, many banks sell their mortgages in the secondary market right away. So therefore, they would never get that payment further out. So it would be much harder to sell them because we have such a large secondary market in mortgages. That's one of the other reasons, because lenders don't want to wait because they want to be able to sell. the mortgage, and the mortgage becomes so linked to the particular property and its appreciation that it would be harder to resale. So many other factors, how well is the home maintained, how well does the town maintain, does anything happen in that town, in that area, and so forth. Taxes, appreciation has been ruled contingent on the interest on the taxes, so the tax is deductible against your ordinary income as far as that goes. But they haven't been very popular.